And welcome to Nature-Based Early Learning Virtual Conference 2020. My name is Jim Embry, and I welcome you to my workshop presentation on George Washington Carver and nature-based learning and its relevance today. I want to thank everyone who's joined in, and even those folks who had an interest in joining in, and hope they will be able to watch this presentation even after today. This topic of nature-based learning has been close to me for a long time. When I was a child growing up in Richmond, Kentucky, I spent so much time in our huge backyard garden and climbing our trees. My family spent most weekends on our grandparents' farm, as we said, out in the country. During the summer, my brother and I spent weeks on our aunt and uncle's farm where we would feed and look after the animals, work in and pick from the garden and the orchards, swim and fish and play in the ponds and streams, and of course, get lost in the woods. We had our own nature-based school right there on the farm. And then later on, when I got married, we always had a big garden around the house that our kids would work and play in. We also visited our two family farms oftentimes during the year. Our 5 kids also attended Montessori school, which meant lots of time outdoors. I've spent many years organizing gardens in schools, faith institutions, and city parks. The farm that I live on now goes back to the 1890s, as my family ancestors after the Civil War were able to save money and buy land. This area of Kentucky, at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and within the Kentucky watershed, prior to European and African colonization, was inhabited by the Cherokee and Chickasaw peoples. Now, indigenous people on Turtle Island were really good at nature-based learning and living for about 30,000 years. So I would encourage Untitled Alliance and NAAEE to integrate this indigenous culture and wisdom into our thinking and practices. Now, a quick look at my involvement with NAAEE. Back in 2018, I became a EE 360 fellow. And then when I attended the 2018 NAAEE conference in Spokane, I received the Rosa Parks and Grace Lee Boggs Award for my many years of work in the social, environmental, and food justice movement. This award had extra meaning for me because I had the honor and humble responsibility of working with both Rosa and Grace in Detroit when I served as a director of the Boggs Center. I don't think the awards committee knew that I had met Rosa Parks in 1968 when I attended Dr. King's funeral. And I'd also met Grace and her husband, Jimmy Boggs, in 1974. Jimmy and Grace became my political mentors until Jimmy died in 92, and Grace died at 100 in 2005. Then last fall, I also served as the co-chair of our local host planning committee, along with Ashley Hoffman, for our NAAEE 2019 conference held right here in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm sure some of you all who are listening in today attended, and I hope you all had a great time. I'm still wearing my derby hat from that gala evening on Friday night. Now, real quickly, I began my activism in 1959 as a 10-year-old member of what's called the Congress of Racial Equality, which was a direct action civil rights organization. And I've been involved in most all the social movements of the last 60 years. And right now, I view that the movement to create sustainable communities, sustainable rural areas, sustainable urban areas, encompasses all these different social movements. When I returned to Kentucky in 2005 from working with Grace in Detroit, I founded Sustainable Communities Network, and our primary mission, we say, is to contribute to the theory and practice of sustainable living. And we do a whole host of things, from organizing gardens in schools, providing education for teachers on beginning school gardens, and working on environmental justice issues. One thing that's very dear to me is what we call therapeutic horticulture, especially working with women at risk. I've been labeled, maybe affectionately, black and green. And then here most recently, I was asked to draft the Equity, Inclusion, Justice Manifesto for Slow Food USA. Back in 2008, I was also asked by the Sustainable World Coalition to be a co-writer for what was called the Sustainable World Sourcebook. Also contributed a few photos. Now, enough about me. Let's talk about George Washington Carver and nature-based learning, and then how it's relevant for today. Now, some of you all who are attending the session might just be thinking, now, Carver, wasn't he the agricultural scientist? And what does that have to do with nature-based learning? So if all goes well today and we keep our tech-savvy operating, and Briggs is able to keep us all together, I hope to be able to provide various reasons why Carver and nature-based learning has a particular meaning and value to our work today. Now, also, when I submitted my proposal months ago, we were not in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as we weren't in the midst of this global Black Lives Matter protest and reckoning of centuries of racial violence and injustice. So I think the topic has even more relevance now. When I speak about nature-based learning, I'm speaking primarily about the nature study movement that began in the mid-1800s or so and reached its peak in the 1940s. This is also the time period which coincided actually with George Washington Carver's life, since he was born around 1860 and died in 1943. Now, relevance number one. Most of George Washington Carver's life, his entire life, was devoted to nature study. There's probably no better example of how nature study can impact an individual's life than Carver's life. As an enslaved and very sickly child, Carver was allowed to spend most of his time in the garden, in the woods. The world of nature was his playmate and teacher. He was allowed to spend hours and hours of his day in the fields, in the streams, and in the forest, observing plants, flowers, insects, and observing all of nature around him. So his love of nature and his lifelong study of nature came quite naturally, even before he had formal schooling. We might say that Carver was an early advocate and practitioner of nature-based learning even as a child. Today, as we seek to become more inclusive in this nature-based learning work, there is no better example, no better role model, no better person to emulate than George Washington Carver. His life and achievements point out very clearly that the lives of our children will matter even more when we commit as a country to make sure that our children spend lots of time outdoors in nature. Relevance number 2. Now, this image here is showing this book by Kevin Armitage, The Nature Study Movement, the Forgotten Popularizer of America's Conservation Ethic, published in 2009. This is the first comprehensive history of the nature study movement. In the book, Kevin says that the nature study movement laid the foundation for American environmental thought, environmental politics, and environmental research, and has had a lasting effect on American culture and society. We could then say that this movement served as the roots of our current environmental organizations like NAAEE, Natural Soil Alliance, Sierra Club, and so forth. Kevin says this largely forgotten history should be studied, reevaluated, because this movement has much to tell us about the American relationship with the non-human world. Relevance number 3. There were people back in the 1860s, much like now, who held the position that human culture did not negatively impact the environment. In response to that notion, George Perkins Marsh, a scholar, a diplomat, and one of the pioneers, if you will, of this movement around nature study, published Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Nature. This was a study, now mind you, 100 years before Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, that described how human action modifies the physical world from the crust of the earth to the atmosphere. So Marsh challenged the general belief that human impact on nature was benign or negligible, and charged that ancient civilizations had brought about their own collapse by their abuse of the environment. So we could say that this book was kind of like the environmental movement's declaration of interdependence. Relevance number 5. Anna Comstock and Liberty Hyde Bailey and other nature study advocates founded the American Nature Society, the American Nature Study Society in 1908. Oh, I think I've missed a slide. Back 1 minute here. Relevance number 4. The Handbook of Nature Study was published by Anna Comstock, and this classic work has been like the natural history Bible for countless teachers and others who seek information about the environment. It was written originally for elementary school teachers who knew little about common plants and animals, and even less about the earth. But this book was, like, for the most part, of such great value back in the 1900s, as it was written in 1911, and it still has value today, and it's still actually available. It's been republished a number of times. So Anna partnered also with Linda Bailey, Liberty Hyde Bailey. They were both at Cornell University. As you know, as you might know, Harvard University and Cornell were in some ways in the Northeast, the center of this movement around nature study. What they said was, the nature study idea will not only teach science, but for a child will open the child's mind to natural existence, develop a sense of responsibility and of self-dependence, inspire a respect for the resources of the earth, teach the obligations of citizenship, quicken their relations to human life in general, and touch their imaginations with the spiritual forces of the world. Relevance number 5. So again, Anna Comstock and Liberty Hyde Bailey and other advocates of nature study founded the American Nature Study Society in 1908. And this was probably the first environmental group in the USA. So this movement around nature study can be said to inspire such things as the conservation movement, the extension programs at many universities, 4-H programs, and things of that nature. But what's also important is that this work by Anna Comstock and Liberty Hyde Bailey also paved the way for other female scientists and scholars, such as Rachel Carlson, to find their calling and their voice. Relevance number 6. Now, let me go back a moment to this book by Kevin Armitage. In this book, Kevin says that George Washington Carver made some of the most original and innovative contributions to the nature study movement by using nature as a way to enrich, improve, enhance the lives of rural African Americans in Alabama and throughout the South. But when we study the articles, the books, and written material about the history of nature study movement, the environmental movement, the conservation movement, the organic farming movement, even as we look even on the NAAEE website, Carver is hardly ever mentioned. So he was one of those forgotten popularizers. However, his life and legacy matters so much today. Now, this image of Carver is how most people see him. He's looked upon as this maybe cowboy who tamed the wild peanuts and made them into peanut butter. But now this connection with peanuts is not really an unfair connection at all. He did earn the nickname the Peanut Man, the Peanut Wizard, for his work with the legume. But it's just one piece of his tremendous body of work. We don't, by just looking at him narrowly as the Peanut Man, we don't give enough credit to the rest of his pioneering and fascinating work. Time magazine called him the Black Da Vinci. His body of work spanned 50 years and touched so many areas. Relevance number 7. George Washington Carver was unique in that he did not separate his devotion to science from his devotion to religion and faith. He united science and religion. He united humans and the environment. Now today we have the scientific understanding of the environment, but in many ways what we are lacking is our sense of spiritual connection with nature. Now, for example, Carver would go out every morning before daybreak to the garden, to the woods, and he would ask the plants and trees to reveal their secrets to him. And they spoke back to him. Now, do we teach our children in nature preschools to talk to plants? Because his work was relevant internationally, Carver in 1916 was made a member of the Royal Society of Arts in England. And he was one of only a handful of Americans to receive this honor. During the 1930s, Carver became very close friends with Henry Ford, and they worked on industrial uses of agricultural products, especially for cars, of course. Now, Henry Ford, that industrial tycoon, that industrial innovator, regarded Carver as one of America's foremost scientists. Carver was also friends with Thomas Edison and was offered a position to lead Edison's research laboratory. But Carver declined because he was committed to Tuskegee and his people in the South. Relevance number 8. Ford and Carver shared a green vision for the USA. This book here, I hope you will take time to order it, pick it up. I mean, if you already read it, The Green Vision of Henry Ford and George Washington Carver, two collaborators in the cause of clean industry. Now, they combined this notion of industrial manufacturing with agricultural production. This vision included just-in-time manufacturing, zero waste, using biofuels. They also worked together to incorporate nature study in schools and communities. Their green vision, in some ways, you can see parts of the vision being used now, is still quite relevant today. Carver also served as a friend and a consultant to numerous presidents, including President Roosevelt. Relevance number 9. Carver had an important hand in encouraging the various presidents and governments during World War I and World War II to adopt his national effort of victory gardens. But in spite of his important contributions, none of the posters, none of the national campaign literature and books and flyers included African Americans or people of color in the design. These are the kinds of examples that demonstrate that Black lives didn't quite matter compared to others back in those eras. So maybe today we need victory gardens throughout our communities to combat health disparities, urban and rural food deserts, poverty, trauma, and drug addiction. Relevance number 10. Carver was so revered when he died that very quickly President Roosevelt issued an executive order, provided funding to create the George Washington Carver National Monument. This was founded back in 1943, soon after Carver died. This was the first national monument dedicated to an African American, and also the first national monument dedicated to a non-president. Now, there are 40+ sites within the National Park Service dedicated to African American heritage. So in our classes on nature study, why don't we include, whether they be virtual tours or actual physical tours of these various sites as part of our work to be more inclusive and to lift up questions of equity at these national park sites. Relevance number 10. After graduating from Iowa State University in 1896 with a master's degree in agriculture, Carver decided to accept the invitation from Booker T. Washington to head up the agricultural research program at Tuskegee Institute. He organized this department with very few things to work with. He had to use, he said, canning jars and other kinds of items that are non-traditional in a well-funded research laboratory. Now, so as he worked there, he became a professor, a researcher, a spiritual guide, and a friend to many, many people. But one of his signature areas of work for 50 years at Tuskegee was around nature study. And he used this as a way to improve the material conditions of the people in the South who had been recently emancipated, like himself, and who were struggling with issues of soil fertility because of the over use of cotton in the various fields. So in this way, Carver was one of the early proponents we might call environmental justice. One of his famous quotes that I like to use a lot is that an injustice to people is an injustice to the soil, as well as, in the contrary, an injustice to the soil is also an injustice to the people. That's environmental justice. Carver knew that he had to improve the fertility of the soil in the South that would support the efforts, again, to improve the material conditions of people who had been recently freed from enslavement. Now, as Carver began to work within this national movement around nature study, we should remember that as he reached out across the South with his bulletins, with his Jessup wagon, with his many other extension efforts, he was working, as this image shows, he was working throughout the South with people who operated schools in these big one-room school buildings. This is a situation where teachers would literally instruct in every subject. But Carver wrote bulletins. He also did the illustrations in the bulletins that were easy to read by teachers, students, and their parents. Public school gardens were a part of the curriculum both for children and adults. So Carver would teach the entire community. Relevance number 11. Most of the teachers in the schools then and now were women who were able to give the students an understanding of how to grow vegetables, but also how to forage for medicinal plants, nuts, berries, in the nearby forest. So nature study was closely linked, to access to adequate food and their very survival. Gardens and forests were seen as separate spaces, but vital aspects of a seamless community of life. Now, Carver was involved in this movement around nature study from the 1890s until his death in 1943. But his lifetime achievements far exceeded those of most anyone else when you look at the humble beginnings as an enslaved child. During these years at Tuskegee, he wrote and illustrated 44 bulletins. From his very second bulletin, written in 1898, Carver says, "There's probably no agent more productive of interest than children's gardens, which embody almost, if not quite every phase of practical rural nature study. If properly presented, new revelations and discoveries will constantly be unfolding before the pupil, increasing his enthusiasm and gradually enlarging his educational horizon. In 1897, the year after he arrived at Tuskegee, Carver wrote his first pamphlet on nature study. He used this publication as a way to reach out to the farmers in Alabama, to the farmers in communities all around the South. Most of the bulletins that he published were published by the thousands and given away free of charge. Carver also used publications like the Progressive Nature Studies. Carver was also part of this book called The Nature Study Idea, written by, again, Liberty Hyde Bailey, as a way to provide instruction for teachers in their classrooms. In 1898, Carver wrote and illustrated his very second bulletin on nature study and children's gardens. This bulletin was, again, one of the many bulletins that he was involved in writing over the course of his 50-year tenure at Tuskegee. Again, I mentioned that Cornell University was one of the centers of this movement around nature study. They had a publication called the Cornell Countryman, and in that publication, Carver wrote, "There's probably no agent more productive of interest than children's gardens, which embody almost, if not quite, every phase of practical rural nature study. If properly presented, new revelations and discoveries will constantly be unfolding before the pupil, increasing his or her enthusiasm and gradually enlarging his or her educational horizons." Excuse me. In 1910, he returned to the theme in bulletin number 18 with Nature Study and Gardening for Rural Schools. This publication and his other works helped to inspire, once again, the Victory Garden movement during World War I. In 1942, 1 year before his death, Carver returned once again to this theme with bulletin number 43, Nature's Garden for Victory and Peace. Again, this publication and his national relationships with presidents and Department of Agriculture provided additional inspiration for the Victory Garden campaigns of World War II. So we talk about then this tremendous legacy of George Washington Carver. He combined science and religion. He talked to plants. He provided education not just for one part of the community, not just the school, but for the family, for the farm, for the community, for the church. Carver could talk to the masses of people. He could talk to the farmers in the South, people who were sharecroppers. He could talk to presidents. He could talk to congressional members. He could talk to industrial tycoons. He could talk to everyone. This is what we need today within our environmental movement, is the ability, the capacity to address the entire community. Carver left the legacy of working on zero waste, simple living, devotion to nature study, healthy diets, local food, organic food. We were talking earlier, Briggs and I, about the Jessup wagon, which was a vehicle that was part of the extension program there at Tuskegee. Rather than having people just come to Tuskegee, Carver believed in going out and meeting the people at their farms, in their communities, in their churches. Maybe we need something similar today within the environmental movement, of where we take the information about environmental education and we take it out to the people in a variety of platforms. Again, Carver was a contributor to what we now call environmental justice. Carver also felt that if you're going to teach about environmental education, if you're going to teach about nature study, you must begin with the soil. The soil is the foundation. The soil is that framework that nature thrives upon, lives upon, grows upon. So he believed in beginning with the soil. We talk about being inclusive. Well, I mean, what better example than Carver's life about being inclusive? He talked to everybody. He had the language when he went to Congress to speak to congressional officials. He had the language in talking to kids, the language in talking to church members, spiritual leaders. He was the epitome, I think, of being inclusive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the recent deaths of George Floyd, my own Kentucky sister, Breonna Taylor, and others, our entire nation has been engulfed in protests, demonstrations in all 50 states, and even also around the world. I've been a part of these demonstrations in my own home community. This Black Lives Matter movement, with a righteous focus on police reform to end police violence towards Black men and women, has also inspired us to use a much larger lens in looking at the remnants of systemic and structural racism within all of our institutions and all of our organizations. Now, just yesterday, we watched the final funeral service for John Lewis. This is where I want to share my last thought about the relevance of George Washington Carver. John Lewis said that he was inspired by Dr. King to get involved in the nonviolent freedom struggle when he was a teenager. And we know how John Lewis held true to those principles throughout his life. And we also know that Dr. King was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi to adopt this nonviolent philosophy and practice. But how did this happen? How did Dr. King wind up adopting this nonviolent philosophy from Gandhi over in India? For many people, this is a forgotten connection. But back in the 1950s, when Dr. King was leading the Montgomery bus boycott, he became friends with Reverend Howard Thurman, and he'd already been friends and a mentee to Benjamin Mays. But Howard Thurman, in his discussion with Dr. King, convinced Dr. King that he should adopt the nonviolent philosophy and practice used by Gandhi within the Southern civil rights struggle. As we know, King did just that. Reverend Thurman had been studying and preaching about this Gandhian philosophy since he met Gandhi 20 years before in 1935. Now on the left here is a picture of Howard Thurman and his wife, Sue Bailey, on their trip to India in 1935. During this trip, they met up with Gandhi and met with him for several weeks, had long conversations, and they also went there to deliver a message to Gandhi from Gandhi's dear friend, George Washington Carver. Thurman had visited Tuskegee several times and had become a mentor or a mentee of George Washington Carver. Carver encouraged Thurman to make this trip to India to visit with Gandhi and to say hello and take a message to Gandhi from Carver. On the right side of the video, you see a picture of Benjamin Mays, who was Dr. King's mentor at Morehouse College, and who also went to India to visit with Gandhi. Both of these men advised Dr. King on the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. Both men got access to Gandhi, having conversations, long conversations, as well as written correspondence, because of Gandhi's friendship and respect and love for George Washington Carver. Yeah. George Washington Carver was the very first African American that Carver created this correspondence with and communication with. This began to occur back in well, actually it began, as I mentioned earlier, that when Carver received membership in the Royal Academy of Arts, Gandhi heard about that and says, wow, like, well, who is this guy in America, this Black American, who's being revered so much by the Royal Academy of Arts? What's his life about? What is he doing there in the South United States? So he began to read about Carver again back around 1916 or so. And then during the late 1920s, they developed this ongoing written correspondence because they had so many similarities. One of Gandhi's close associates, named Andrew Bailey, was on tour. He's a British guy, and he came to the United States, was touring, and he was talking and preaching and lecturing about this nonviolent philosophy, nonviolent practice of Mahatma Gandhi and the struggles of the people in India. So again, Andrew came to Tuskegee on his tour. He met with Carver and began this close relationship between Carver and Gandhi. They recognized that they came from a similar past. They both were working on improving the lives of the masses of poor people, whether they're in India or they're in the US South. They both believed in living simply. They both had this deep, abiding devotion to a spiritual path. They both believed in nonviolence. I mean, oftentimes Carver gets ridiculed by some people for not taking strong, direct action steps and maybe even more provocative language. But Carver was a believer and a practitioner of nonviolent living and nonviolent speaking. So my point is that it was through Carver and his relationship with Gandhi that passed this sense of movement philosophy up through Howard Thurman, up through Benjamin Mays, up through Dr. King, and then of course up through John Lewis. So I'm going to close my presentation now. I hope I provided just a few reasons why the legacy of George Washington Carver and his legacy that is so closely intertwined with nature study. I hope we can see that these historical figures, these historical movements are quite relevant today. So I thank you, and I open up for comments, questions, and so forth. Thank you all so much. So Briggs, are you there?
I am. Folks, if y'all should be able to unmute to ask any questions or provide comments, or you can go ahead and put them in the chat box. Jim, if you've got the chat box open, it looks like folks are using that. If that works for you.
Okay, chat box. Maybe read them to me.
All right. Recommendations on adult books to learn about Carver's life.
Okay. I have, I presented a list of downloads for the workshop, okay? And some of them are my own personal writings about Carver. In that download, I list several books, but also I have here with me, again, I mentioned the book, The Green Vision of Carver and Ford is a great book, okay, that describes that collaboration he had with Ford for many years. There's another book, Carver in His Own Words. It takes Carver's actual writings, his speeches, his church sermons, his letters, his testimony at the congressional hearing, and gives you a book of his actual words. If you go, so again, there are two federal parks and monuments to Carver. One is his home birthplace. But anyway, if you go to the national website for the George Washington Carver National Monument, they have a beautiful website, and on there are several books that you can download as a PDF. And one of the very best books is on their website about Carver's life. But there are, I mean, there's just a whole, I also have on my own website, which is sustainlex.org, okay, sustainlex.org. If you go to that website, there's a link that's called a compilation of Carver legacy. I've just spent years compiling books, articles, videos, bulletins, and things like that about Carver's life. It's a pretty comprehensive compilation. But again, I recommend this book about Carver and Ford, because it gives you this expansive idea that Carver was working just on the peanut, but he was working with Ford on how to create biofuels, how to create rubber from U.S. agricultural products, how to use flax and other grains to be used in automobile manufacturing, to become like some of the cushion for the upholstery or the seating in the cars, for the steering wheel, and things like that. Those are a few thoughts.
Okay, Carrie asks if you have any advice to implementing environmental justice into nature-based curricula.
Well, I think that, well, one thing you might want to do is, first of all, is do a study. I would say, again, I can provide, if you email me, folks, feel free to email me, feel free to call me, okay. I was kind of born back with the dinosaurs, so my brain is getting a little fossilized. I've got a little bit of gray matter left, but I'm here to serve you all. Call me, email me. I'm very willing to share conversations, materials, links, and whatever else. But I would encourage folks to go online and do a search for what was called the environmental justice are the people of color environmental organization, as well as Native Americans have what's called the Indigenous Environmental Network. I would go online and study the history of these movements and these organizations. So you get a kind of a grounding in what we tend to call the environmental justice movement. But also just to kind of create, an awareness of what are the environmental conditions in your community. What are the conditions that impact largely in your community people of color, and begin then to connect up with those organizations. So for me, as an activist, it's important to develop, we say, curriculum, but it's also important to develop community relationships. That way, you might need to have at your school, whether it's a preschool or elementary, K through 12 or whatever, you can have a curriculum, you can have books, but you also, I think you need to give students a chance to go out and walk and tour community conditions and whatever. Bring people in, go out and talk to elders. But it's important to make the classroom within the walls of the school building, but also the classroom is in the community, which means creating again in your community these kinds of relationships. However, of course, there are websites. I have a bunch of things on my website that are particular, call them lesson plans, materials, books, videos that kind of lay out, if you will, this inclusion of environmental justice. But as I told some youth who interviewed me about a week ago, it means to create this sense of love for your community, this sense of respect, empathy for your community and the conditions that impact your community. A sense of, again, of love, empathy, respect. If you have that, then you will find these creative, innovative ways to include environmental justice within a curriculum around nature study. Because again, recognizing that our country's founding was founded upon injustice that related to nature, whether it's coming into the country as Europeans and taking the land of indigenous people, doing all kinds of things to desecrate the land, the trees, the buffalo. So our country was founded upon injustice. Then we enslave people, we bring them over to work in the plantations, work in the farms, and so forth. So our country's history already has in it environmental injustice. I would say just widen your eyes, just open your eyes a little wider, and I think that you will see these elements of environmental injustice.
Paula asks how you would envision Dr. Carver being recognized in nature programs.
Oh, well, I think that in my view, if I were running a school, okay, if I had a school, with a preschool, a K through 12, I would have images of Carver and other people, not just Carver, images of Carver all around the school. If I had a science lab, a biology lab, a zoology lab, whatever, I would have images of Carver in the classroom, okay? I would have a science club named for Carver, okay? I would have, many schools have these green clubs, okay? Well, name the green clubs. The George Washington Carver Green Club at your school, okay? The point is just to make his life and legacy come alive. There are some great videos about his life all around. Take the bulletins that he's published, find them, print them, make them available, okay? Read from them, study them. These books, he would talk about how to use everything in around your school, okay? Everything has a purpose and a usability. So these bulletins, while they were printed in 1890s, 1900s are still relevant today. I mean, you can't get much better. You can't get much better than what he was presenting. So again, there are all kinds of ways, I think, all kinds of ways to incorporate him within preschools, nature study. His specialty, by the way, one quick thought. Carver, his first love was art, not science per se, art. Okay, it was his first love, and he wanted to be an artist, but he was advised by some pretty smart people. Well, as an African American, you probably aren't going to be able to earn a good living right now as an artist. But if you go to school and study agriculture, you may have a career in that, and what a career he had. So I think that points out that we can bring some of Carver's images. He won an art exhibit at the Chicago State Fair. He would paint his whole life. Okay, so the idea of including art is a way to introduce Carver's life by including art within the things that we do in our preschools around nature study. This is what Carver did. He drew plants and he studied plants. Hope that might help.
Judy asks if there are specifically children's books that you would recommend about Carver or any of the other folks you've talked about today.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I had on one of my slides, there was a small picture of, let me see if I have it here. Well, anyway, there's, again, if folks contact me, okay, I can send you a list of children's books about Carver. One is, I think it's called Carver in the Garden. It's a beautiful, colorful book full of illustrations for children. And again, there's a whole host of books about Carver designed for young people. And I have a list of those in this compilation. And there's some really beautiful books. There's, again, it's just, there are books for, teenagers. Here's one here that's kind of designed for more the teenage age group of people. Okay, Carver, scientist and educator. Then there's a book of poems where this author is lifting up Carver's legacy in a poetic kind of a fashion. Again, there's some great videos out there as well. Hope that's helpful.
All right. Does anybody, have any further questions? We're getting close to time. Okay, I will exercise a little bit of moderator's prerogative and ask you, Jim, the last question. If going off of what we talked about earlier, that the modern EE movement needs a Jessup wagon movement.
Yes.
Its claim to fame was the agronomy that Carver was teaching was personally relevant to the lives of the rural poor African Americans that he was teaching it to. What are some of the most relevant lessons that EE could teach right now that are most relevant to the lives of individuals who've never heard of EE before? And if you were going out and making the pitch, how would you make it relevant enough to them that they would pick up on the idea?
Okay, well, again, a lot of my work that I've been doing for 40 some years is within what we call urban gardens. And that's my work within schools, faith institutions, and other parks and things like that. So what I would do is take the Jessup wagon concept and come out to communities. That means neighborhoods, and get people involved in knowing their community. It could mean things like establishing gardens in folks' backyards, their front yards, their schools, empty lots, at their churches and faith institutions, and so forth, okay? But engaging people in growing food for themselves, knowing how to prepare the food, how to cook the food, how to preserve the food, because those things are part of the problem of the health disparities that we saw so graphically during this COVID-19 pandemic. So we know that people need access to healthier food, need access to better quality food, need access to land to begin to remember how to grow food. I would do things like that. What I've also done with schools and neighborhood and churches is like a neighborhood walk. We'll just get a group of people, like we did when we were at NAAEE this fall. I conducted a walk from the convention center area over to the Murphy Art Garden. Along the way, I described the historical buildings, the different entertainment centers, but I also talked about the gardens we saw, the trees we saw, the flowers we saw. So I've done walks with kids in their neighborhood. Now talk about the dandelion that we see, how it can be used, how it has been used traditionally. Talk about the names of trees and their impact, what trees do. So I think that within the EE movement, we need to make the neighborhood spaces relevant to people. Make the neighborhood spaces come alive, because we teach people that, well, you have the school building and you go in there to be educated, but what's around you has no relevance. These trees around you, these flowers, these weeds, these birds, these insects have no relevance. I'm a believer in I can go out in a 1 foot square area of a yard, of a school, of a park, and spend an hour right there in a 1 foot square area and discover all kinds of things. So it means making children's lives more relevant, making their own homes relevant, making their schools relevant, making the trees that they walk past relevant, creating a knowledge of their community that includes the knowledge of the natural structures, not just the buildings, not just the sidewalk, but having a knowledge of your neighborhood from an environmental perspective.
All right, Jim. Well, we really appreciate this presentation. I hope everyone listening enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you, Briggs. Thank you all. Love y'all much. We'll enjoy the rest of Virtual Conference 2020. This probably will be a model for our fall NAAEE conference as well. Love y'all much. Thanks for joining in.